When a man waits for someone he has never seen, he builds an image in his mind that rarely corresponds to reality. Billy Thompson knew every crack in the wood of the porch where he sat every afternoon. The dry wind from Arizona carried with it the promise of change, but for 3 years in a row, that promise had proved empty like the well that had dried up the previous summer. He folded and unfolded the letter yellowed by time, the words already memorized like a prayer. Margaret Whitfield from Boston, 27 years, educated, willing to start a new life in the West. The letter had arrived through a reputable marriage agency. Billy had paid $5, a fortune for him, and had waited 4 months for an answer. When she arrived, her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. The handwriting was firm, decisive. The words, direct and practical. She was not talking about love or romanticism, but about hard work and purpose. This reassured him more than any promise of eternal devotion. Billy's ranch was 20 miles from the nearest town, a modest set of buildings that he had erected with his own hands. The main house had 2 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace that worked when the wind blew in the right direction. It wasn't much, but it was honest, like him. For weeks, Billy had been preparing everything for Margaret's arrival. She repaired the loose porch boards, painted the interior walls with fresh lime, and planted wildflowers around the house. Little touches she hoped she would appreciate. He bought fabrics in the city and asked the merchant's wife to sew new curtains for the kitchen. Each preparation was a silent prayer that she would stay, that she would find something there worthy of calling home. The stagecoach would arrive on a Thursday. Billy knew this because he had checked the Chronicle 10 times with the postmaster. He woke up before dawn that day, shaved himself with extra care, and put on his best shirt, the only one with no visible patches. He saddled his tamest horse and left for the city 2 hours in advance. Anxiety grew in his chest like a summer storm, inevitable and powerful. In the town's main square, Billy waited along with other onlookers. News of mail-order brides spread quickly in small communities, and he knew that half the population was there out of both solidarity and curiosity. The sun was rising relentlessly when they finally heard the distant noise of wheels and horses kicking up dust on the road. The stagecoach stopped with a familiar creak. The coachman came down heavily and began to unload luggage. Billy searched among the passengers, who got off for a woman who matched Margaret's description of herself. Brown hair, medium height, light eyes. An elderly lady emerged first, followed by a prosperous-looking merchant, and then by a young man who was clearly coming to seek work in the nearby mines. Finally, an unexpected figure descended from the stagecoach. The woman was tall, taller than Billy had imagined. Her hair was indeed brown, but tied into a stern bun that revealed the strong line of her jaw. The eyes, when they met his through the small crowd, were a piercing blue that seemed to assess everything around with the precision of an experienced merchant. She wore a simple travel dress, but there was something about her posture that suggested strength, not just physical, but a determination that Billy immediately recognized as familiar. Margaret Whitfield was not what he had expected. It was something completely different, and perhaps exactly what he needed. Margaret Whitfield carried only a worn leather suitcase and a carefully tied bundle. Billy approached with the hat in his hands, feeling the curious looks of the townspeople on them. When she greeted him with a simple nod, he noticed that her hands were rough like his, hands that knew heavy lifting. The path back to the ranch was traveled in contemplative silence. Margaret watched the barren landscape intently, as if she were cataloguing every detail. The solitary cacti, the rock formations that stood as natural monuments, the vastness that stretched as far as the eye could see. Billy noticed that she didn't seem intimidated by the immensity of the place. On the contrary, there was something about his posture that suggested familiarity with open spaces and distant horizons. When they arrived at the ranch, Margaret got off her horse without help and stood in front of the house for a long moment. His eyes scanned every detail: the wildflowers Billy had planted, the new curtains on the kitchen window, the manicured wood on the porch. She nodded once, as if approving of what she saw, and Billy felt such a deep relief that it almost made him dizzy. That first night, Billy prepared the best meal he knew how to make: pork with beans and fresh bread he had bought in the city. Margaret ate quietly, but wiped her plate thoroughly. After the scene, she got up and started washing the dishes without him asking. Billy watched her efficient hands working in the basin of warm water and noticed that she executed each movement with the precision of someone who had taken care of many houses before. During the next few days, a strange and comforting routine settled between them. Margaret woke up before dawn and was already in the kitchen when Billy came downstairs for breakfast. She didn't talk much, but she observed everything: how he took care of the animals, how he organized his daily work, how he reacted to the small setbacks that were part of rural life. Billy felt he was being evaluated, but not in a hostile way. It was as if she was learning his language. On the third day, Billy found Margaret in the coop, examining the birds with professional attention. She had rearranged the nests and thoroughly cleaned the enclosure. As he approached, she pointed to a chicken that was separated from the others. The animal showed signs of illness that Billy had not noticed. Margaret had already prepared a simple herbal treatment she had found growing near the well. At that moment, Billy realized that he had received much more than a mail-order wife. The transformation of the ranch was gradual, but remarkable. Not only did Margaret take care of the house with impressive efficiency, but she also contributed practical knowledge that Billy had never possessed. She knew which wild plants could be used as medicines, how to make soap with animal fat and ashes, how to preserve meat for the harsher months. Her neatly tied package contained seeds of vegetables that didn't grow naturally in Arizona, and she planted them in beds that she prepared with technique and patience. The nights were the most revealing moments. After dinner, they both sat on the porch and watched the stars in silent companionship. Billy noticed that Margaret always looked east, in the direction she had come from. It wasn't nostalgia that he saw in his eyes, but something more complex. It was as if she was measuring the distance traveled, not only geographically, but emotionally. Within a week of her arrival, Margaret began to show small signs that she considered the place home. She moved the furniture in the living room to a more practical layout, changed the position of the pots in the kitchen to make daily work easier, and hung curtains she had sewn in her spare time in the room they now occupied separately. Each change was subtle but significant. It was as if she was marking territory in a respectful but decisive way. Billy realized that he was beginning to know Margaret's rhythms. She was most active on cool mornings and became contemplative when the sun was at its brightest. He liked to work with his hands and found satisfaction in tasks that produced visible results. There was a quiet strength in her that complemented his most evident determination. Together, they were creating something that neither of them could have built on their own. The first summer storm arrived without warning in the second week. Billy woke up to the wind howling around the house and the rain hitting the windows with unusual force. When he went downstairs to the kitchen, he found Margaret already dressed and preparing coffee with precise movements, as if morning storms were part of her daily routine. She had closed all the windows and placed buckets strategically placed to trim the water dripping from the ceiling at two specific points. The storm brought bigger problems than leaks. During the morning, Billy discovered that part of the pasture fence had been knocked down by the strong winds, and 3 of his best sheep had fled. The situation was dire. Losing cattle meant losing income that he could not afford to waste. Margaret watched his concern in silence, then disappeared inside the house for a few minutes. When he returned, he wore sturdy leather boots that Billy had never seen before and carried a rope wrapped with professional precision. Together, they set out in search of the lost sheep. Margaret rode with natural skill, keeping Billy's pace without difficulty, even when the terrain was made uneven and slippery by the recent rain. She didn't just accompany the search, she led parts of it, pointing to footprints in the mud and suggesting directions with sure gestures that demonstrated experience with runaway animals. They found the sheep trapped in a narrow canyon, frightened and unable to find their way back. Margaret got off her horse and approached the animals with slow, calculated movements. His hands moved with firm gentleness, calming the critters as Billy prepared the rope to guide them back. Watching her work, he realized that Margaret knew animals in the same way she knew medicinal plants, with practical intimacy born of necessity and experience. The return to the ranch revealed more about Margaret than weeks of quiet coexistence. She helped Billy fix the fence efficiently that spoke of years of repairing similar structures. Her hands handled tools as natural extensions of her will, and she anticipated every movement needed before Billy needed to call for help. They worked in harmony, as if they had been partners for decades. That night, as they were drying their wet clothes by the fireplace, Billy noticed a small but deep scar on Margaret's right hand. It was old, already faded by time, but the mark suggested a significant injury. When she noticed his gaze, Margaret simply closed her hand and continued folding her dry clothes. There was no embarrassment in his gesture, just a clear indication that certain stories belonged to the past. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamic between them. Margaret began to take small but important initiatives. She reorganized the tool store for greater efficiency, suggested changes in the feeding schedule of the animals that resulted in better milk production, and established a rotation system for the vegetables in the garden that promised more abundant harvests. Billy realized that he was beginning to trust Margaret's judgment in ways that surprised him. When she pointed to clouds on the horizon and prepared the house for rain, he didn't question it. When she separated an animal from the herd for some reason that only she understood, Billy knew there was a valid reason. Margaret possessed instincts sharpened by experience, and these instincts were being applied to improve the lives of both of them. One afternoon, while Billy was fixing a problem at the windmill, Margaret appeared next to him, carrying tools that he had not asked for, but that were exactly what he needed. She held parts in place while he tightened screws, anticipated his movements, and facilitated a job that would normally require 2 trips to the shop. When they finished, the mechanism worked better than it had in months. That night, Billy understood something fundamental about his situation. Margaret was not just a woman who had agreed to marry a stranger by mail order. She was someone who had made a calculated decision based on mutual need and practical compatibility. There was no romanticism in their choice, but there was something more solid, a recognition that together they could build something sustainable and meaningful. Porch nights have become quiet planning times. Margaret pointed to areas of the ranch where improvements were possible. Billy shared his knowledge of local weather patterns and market cycles. They weren't talking about feelings or making romantic promises, but they were building a foundation of trust and common purpose that was perhaps more enduring than passion. The first real test of their partnership came with an unexpected visitor. Billy was in the field when he saw the dust kicked up by a lone rider approaching the ranch. From the irregular movement of the horse, he realized that something was wrong. When he got closer to the house, he found Margaret on the porch, watching the man he had just dismounted with obvious difficulty. The stranger was young, perhaps in his early 20s, but his clothes were torn and he limped noticeably. Dried blood stained his shirt, and his face showed signs of extreme exhaustion. Margaret had already brought a basin of water and clean cloths, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had dealt with injuries before. She didn't ask his name or what had happened. She simply began to clean the wound on his leg with steady, careful hands. Billy recognized the type of injury. It was the work of bullets, old enough to have begun to heal, but infected by the lack of proper care. The boy was feverish and had clearly ridden for days without stopping. His clothes and equipment suggested that he had left in a hurry, taking only the essentials. It was the kind of situation that could bring problems to those who offered help. Margaret worked in silence, cleaning and bandaging the wound with materials she had prepared without hesitation. Her hands were gentle but decisive, and she applied a paste made from herbs that Billy had seen her prepare earlier. The young man lost consciousness during treatment, but his breathing became more regular as Margaret completed her work. She didn't look to Billy for approval or instruction. She simply did what she felt was necessary. For 3 days, the stranger lay unconscious in the drawing room, which Margaret had turned into a temporary infirmary. She prepared nutritious broths and applied cold compresses when the fever rose. Billy watched as she cared for the injured man with medical competence that he clearly hadn't learned from books. Her every move revealed practical experience with similar situations, knowledge acquired through necessity. On the 4th day, the young man woke up and was able to sit up. His eyes showed genuine gratitude, but also concern. He tried to get up several times, clearly eager to continue his journey, but Margaret kept him lying down with firm but gentle gestures. Billy realized that she had assessed the situation thoroughly. The man was running away from something, but posed no danger to them. His experience allowed him to make these distinctions accurately. When the visitor was finally able to stand and walk without support, Margaret prepared provisions for his trip. Enough water for 2 days, dried meat, and a small amount of the medicines she had used to treat him. She also gave him silent instructions on how to care for the wound during the trip, demonstrating with practical gestures how to change the dressings and when to apply the medicinal ointment. The boy left at dawn, after helping Billy with his morning chores as a form of payment for the hospitality received. Before mounting, he looked at Margaret with an expression that Billy recognized. It was the same look of respect and gratitude that he himself had developed for her. The stranger understood that he had been saved not only by kindness, but by extraordinary competence. After the visitor's departure, Billy and Margaret resumed their routine, but something had changed between them. Billy had seen Margaret make difficult decisions without hesitation, take responsibility without asking permission, and demonstrate skills that suggested a more complex past than his letters had revealed. She wasn't just an educated Boston woman seeking a new life. She was someone with experience in situations that required courage and practical knowledge. Margaret, for her part, had watched as Billy reacted to the presence of the wounded stranger. He did not ask inconvenient questions, expressed no concern about possible consequences, and supported their decisions without question. She had seen men who would have refused help out of fear, or who would have demanded explanations that were none of their business. Billy had simply trusted his judgment and offered support when needed. Over the next few nights, as they sat on the porch, they both seemed more at ease with each other. Margaret occasionally pointed to constellations in the night sky, demonstrating knowledge of celestial navigation that surprised Billy. He, in turn, shared stories about the land, which areas were best for grazing at different times of the year, where to find water during dry periods, how to read the signs that preceded severe storms. Billy began to realize that Margaret had chosen his ranch not only as a refuge, but as a place where her skills would be valued and needed. She wasn't trying to forget her past, but to use the lessons learned to build a better future. Together, they were creating something that went beyond mutual convenience. They were forming a partnership based on respect, competence, and shared purpose. The experience with the injured visitor had revealed aspects of both that letters could never communicate. Billy knew now that Margaret was someone he could trust in any situation, and she had seen that he was a man who supported his decisions even when he didn't fully understand the reasons behind them. 3 months after Margaret's arrival, Billy woke up to the sound of a hammer coming from outside the house. It was still very early, even before sunrise, but Margaret was already working on something in the yard. When he went out to investigate, he found her building a small fence next to the chicken coop. His hands moved with precision, and each board was perfectly aligned. She had planned and started the project herself, but when Billy approached, she simply handed him a hammer, as if his help was expected and welcome. They worked together on the construction all morning. Margaret had designed a space for goats, animals she considered essential to the ranch's prosperity. She explained with practical gestures how the goats would provide additional milk, how their presence would help control the overgrowth of unwanted plants, and how they could be an extra source of income during the most difficult months. Billy realized that she was thinking not only of the present, but planning improvements for future years. The arrival of the goats, a week later, brought a new energy to the ranch. Margaret had personally chosen them in town, negotiating prices with skill that impressed even the seasoned merchant. She knew signs of animal health that Billy had never noticed, and she selected 3 young females that quickly adapted to their new environment. Watching her take care of the new animals revealed another facet of her competence. She had a natural instinct to bond with creatures of all kinds. During the fall, Billy noticed that Margaret had established discreet but important connections with other women in the area. She traded home remedies for tissue, offered advice on animal care in exchange for local recipes, and gradually became a respected presence in the small but close-knit community. Their reputation grew not through social conversation, but through practical results and help offered when needed. The first winter together brought severe storms that tested all the preparations they had made. Margaret had insisted on stockpiling more firewood than Billy considered necessary, had preserved generous amounts of vegetables and meat, and prepared the house for cooler temperatures than he expected. When the heaviest snowfall of the decade blanketed the region for 2 weeks, Billy realized that Margaret's predictions had been accurate. They got through the difficult period not only comfortably, but with enough provisions to help neighbors who had not prepared properly. During the long winter nights, sitting by the fireplace, Billy and Margaret developed a form of communication that went beyond words. He learned to interpret her expressions when she planned improvements for spring. She recognized his gestures when he identified problems that needed to be solved. Together, they drew maps of the ranch on the dirt floor of the living room, planning expansions and improvements that would transform the place into something bigger than either of them could have imagined alone. In the spring, Margaret unveiled her most ambitious project. She wanted to establish a small orchard on the protected hillside behind the house. He had brought fruit tree seeds and seedlings in his original luggage, guarding them carefully during the winter months. Her vision included apples, pears, and even some varieties of fruit that she knew would adapt to the local climate with proper care. It was an investment that would take years to bear fruit, but it demonstrated his intention to stay and build something lasting. Billy helped prepare the ground for the orchard with genuine enthusiasm. Each tree planted was a symbol of mutual commitment to the future they were building. Margaret had brought not only practical skills, but a long-term vision that perfectly complemented Billy's dogged determination. Together, they were creating a legacy that would benefit future generations. A year after Margaret's arrival, Billy realized that the ranch had become something unrecognizable. Production had increased, the estate was more organized and efficient, and they had established a reputation in the region as reliable suppliers of quality products. More importantly, he had found a partner who shared his work ethic and core values. Margaret, for her part, had found exactly what she was looking for. Not a romantic husband, but an honest man who respected her competence and supported her initiatives. She had left behind any life she had had before, but not as an escape or giving up. She had made a calculated and courageous choice, investing her skills in a future she would help shape. On summer afternoons, when they sat on the porch watching the sun go down over the land they had improved together, Billy and Margaret rarely needed words. They had built something solid based on shared work, mutual respect, and a common vision. It was unlike any novel Billy had imagined, but it was real, sustainable, and deeply satisfying. The lone farmer had found much more than a mail-order bride. He had found a partner for life, someone whose hawk eyes saw possibilities where others saw only challenges. Together, they proved that the best partnerships are born not from blind passion, but from mutual recognition of strength, purpose, and character. What started as a practical arrangement had grown into something far more valuable, a union based on trust, competence, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. If you enjoyed this engaging story of the Wild West and want to follow more exciting narratives about courage, partnership, and the challenges of life on the American frontier, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell.